Zara, the cougar, spent over 20 years in chains at a circus. When animal activists finally rescued her and set her free, they believed she would embrace life in the wild. But what happened next left everyone heartbroken. The first time the circus staff saw Zara, she was just a cub, small and full of energy. To them, she wasn't just an animal, she was an attraction, a future star. She was placed in a cage and given just enough food to grow strong, but not enough to grow independent. The training started early. At first, it was simple commands, rewards for obedience. Then, as she grew, the methods became harsher. The crowds loved her performances. She jumped through flaming hoops, balanced on narrow beams, and roared on command. But behind the curtain, her life was far from glamorous. Her world was a cage, the cold steel bars surrounding her at all times. The space was small, barely enough to move. When she wasn't performing, she was chained, the metal collar tight around her neck. At night, she would hear the distant sounds of the other animals, elephants swaying in their stalls, lions pacing in their enclosures, bears groaning in their sleep. None of them were free. The circus traveled from one city to the next, but it made no difference to Zara. Her world never changed. She never saw the open sky without bars in front of her, never felt the ground that wasn't a hard floor. Years passed. Zara grew, but her spirit faded. The once strong and graceful cougar became thin and tired. Her muscles weakened from lack of movement, her ribs pressed against her skin. The fire in her eyes dulled. She didn't fight anymore. She had learned that it didn't matter. She stopped reacting when the trainers came with their whips. She stopped resisting when they tightened the chains. She stopped hoping that things could be different. She had accepted that this was her life. Then one day, everything changed. An animal activist group came to inspect the circus. They walked past rows of animals, each one a prisoner in its own way. When they reached Zara, they stopped. She wasn't like the others. The lions still roared in frustration. The elephants still swayed in their sadness. But Zara just lay there, her golden eyes blank, her body unmoving. One of the activists crouched down, looking at her closely. Her fur was dull, her paws cracked from years of standing on hard surfaces. The deep grooves from the collar around her neck told the story of 2 decades in captivity. They knew right away, this was an animal who had lost everything. The fight to free her began that same night. The activists gathered evidence, took pictures, documented everything. They reached out to organizations, started petitions, contacted authorities. The circus refused at first, insisting she was fine, but the pressure grew. Protests formed outside the tents. The media picked up the story. The circus had no choice. After weeks of negotiations, they gave in. Zara was finally free. But she didn't know that. When the activists arrived to take her away, she didn't react. She didn't struggle, but she didn't move either. Even when they unlocked the chains, even when they carefully led her into the transport cage, she remained silent. The people around her were cheering, smiling, celebrating the victory. But Zara just lay down inside the cage, resting her head on her paws. She had spent 20 years as a captive. She had never known anything else. And she had no idea what freedom meant. Zara the cougar lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness. But her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. The truck rumbled along the road, carrying her toward a new life. The metal transport cage was wider than the one she had known for years, and there was no heavy chain around her neck, but it didn't feel any different. She lay still, her body weak, her mind empty. The activists spoke in soft voices, trying to reassure her. Some reached through the bars, offering gentle touches, but Zara didn't flinch or move away. She didn't react at all. For 20 years, human hands had only ever meant control. Now they were kind, but she didn't know the difference. Hours passed. The smell of damp earth and fresh air filled the space as the truck neared its destination. For the first time in her life, the air wasn't thick with the scent of smoke and sweat, but Zara didn't lift her head to notice. When the truck finally stopped, the doors swung open and she was surrounded by new sounds. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves rustled under the wind. The activists carefully opened the transport cage, stepping back to give her space. They expected her to hesitate at first, but hoped she would take her first steps into freedom on her own. She didn't. She remained where she was, staring at nothing. It wasn't fear keeping her frozen, it was something deeper. She didn't understand where she was or why she was here. She had never been given choices before, and now that she had one, she didn't know what to do with it. Minutes passed before one of the caretakers gently coaxed her forward. Slowly, with stiff, unsteady movements, Zara stepped out. Her paws touched the ground, but it wasn't the hard metal she had always known. It was soft, covered in dirt and grass. She pressed down carefully, as if unsure if it would hold her weight. The enclosure was wide, far bigger than the cage she had lived in for so long. There were trees, small rocks, places to hide, but instead of exploring, she took a few steps forward, then lowered herself onto the ground. She didn't look around. She didn't run. She simply lay there. The team watched from a distance, their excitement fading into quiet concern. Most rescued animals took time to adjust, but Zara was different. She wasn't just lost. She was empty. A veterinarian approached carefully, kneeling beside her. She didn't resist as he ran his hands over her thin frame, checking her condition. Her fur was dull, her muscles weak, her ribs visible. She was still breathing, still alive, but that was all. They brought her fresh food, thick raw meat, more than she had ever been given at once. But she didn't lunge for it. She ate slowly, cautiously, as if expecting it to be taken away. Days passed. Zara ate, but she didn't gain much weight. She walked, but never far. She watched everything, but reacted to nothing. The caretakers told themselves she just needed time. She had been through too much. She had spent 20 years as a prisoner. It was natural for her to be slow to adjust. But deep down, they wondered if time would ever be enough. Once her health improved slightly, the next step of the plan was set in motion. They would take her to a protected reserve, a place where she could finally live as a wild cougar. It was a sanctuary, a safe place, free from cages, free from chains. She would be given a second chance to be what she was meant to be. When the day came, the excitement returned. The activists had done everything to prepare. A tracking collar was placed around her neck so they could monitor her. A team was assigned to watch over her, ensuring she would have every chance to succeed. The transport cage was opened once more, this time at the edge of a vast, open landscape. There were trees stretching into the distance, rocky cliffs perfect for climbing. It was everything she should have wanted. Zara stepped out. She blinked against the bright sunlight, taking slow, hesitant steps forward. The wilderness stretched before her, open and endless. She was free. But she didn't run. She didn't explore. She walked to a nearby boulder and curled up beside it, pressing herself against the solid rock. She wasn't free. She was just lost. Zara the cougar lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness. But her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. She didn't run. She didn't explore. She walked to a nearby boulder and curled up beside it, pressing herself against the solid rock. She wasn't free. She was just lost. The team stood at a distance, watching, waiting. They had expected hesitation, maybe even fear. But they had also expected her instincts to take over, for something deep inside her to wake up. They had imagined her moving through the trees, sniffing the air, marking her territory. Instead, she just stayed there, unmoving, staring at nothing. The first night passed in silence. The team, watching from a safe distance, saw no change in her. She didn't venture out, didn't test the limits of her new world. When morning came, she was in the same place. It wasn't fear that kept her still. It was something else. The wild was supposed to be her home, but she had never known it. She had spent her whole life in captivity, where food was given to her, where her movements were controlled, where she had never once been allowed to make a choice. Now, faced with endless space, she didn't know what to do. When she finally moved, it wasn't with purpose. She stood up, stretched her thin limbs, and took slow, careful steps forward. The ground beneath her paws was soft, uneven. It wasn't the cold, hard floor she had known for so long. It felt unfamiliar. She walked a few paces, then stopped. She turned her head, looking around, but her body language was hesitant. She didn't recognize the sounds of the wild. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the whisper of wind through the trees, all of it was foreign. The team, watching through binoculars, saw it clearly. She wasn't adjusting. She was just existing. Days passed, and Zara remained within the same small area. She didn't roam, didn't claim territory, didn't act like a wild cougar. The team monitored her movements through the tracking collar, but there was barely anything to track. She never strayed far from the boulder where she had first settled. Then the real problem began. She was hungry. She had always been fed by humans. She had never stalked prey, never hunted for herself. The instincts should have been there, buried deep, waiting to be awakened, but they weren't. The first time she saw a squirrel dart across the ground, she stiffened. Her eyes followed its movement, her body tensed as if something inside her recognized what she was supposed to do. But she didn't move. She didn't chase. She just watched as it disappeared into the trees. When she finally tried to hunt, it was clumsy. She saw a bird pecking at the dirt and made a slow, awkward approach. But she didn't crouch low, didn't move with the precision of a predator. Long before she got close, the bird noticed her and flew away. She tried again with a rabbit. It ended the same way. She didn't know how to be silent. She didn't know how to stalk. She had never needed to. And so she went hungry. Days turned into a week, and the effects became visible. She was losing weight. The little muscle she had gained in rehabilitation was fading. Her ribs began to show again. Then something unexpected happened. She found a carcass. It was the remains of a deer left behind by another predator. And for the first time since being released, she ate. But it wasn't a hunt. It wasn't what cougars were meant to do. She wasn't a predator. She had become a scavenger. The team watched in growing concern. This wasn't natural. She should have been the one making the kill, not picking at leftovers like a vulture, but she had no choice. It was the only way she could survive. As more time passed, Zara continued to grow thinner. She found scraps here and there, but it wasn't enough. Then one morning, the team checked the tracker and saw no movement. She hadn't gotten up. She hadn't moved at all. The worst fear settled over them. Zara, the cougar they had fought so hard to free, was dying. Zara. The cougar lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness. But her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. She had been losing weight for weeks. She had no strength to hunt, no instincts to guide her. Hunger made her desperate, and instead of stalking prey, she scavenged for scraps, picking at carcasses left behind by other animals. But it wasn't enough. Her body was failing. Then one morning, she didn't get up. The tracking collar showed no movement. The team, watching from a distance, had grown used to her pacing in circles, wandering aimlessly. But now, she was still, too still. A field monitor was sent out. He moved cautiously, following the signal from her collar. The wind rustled through the trees, the air carrying the scent of damp earth. But there was no sign of her, no movement, no sound. Then he saw her. She was lying on her side, curled up beneath the same boulder she had claimed as her shelter. Her breathing was shallow. Her golden eyes, once dull, were barely open. The closer he got, the worse she looked. Her ribs were sharply defined, her once powerful limbs thin and frail. But it was her gums that made him freeze. They were yellow. He called for backup immediately. Within minutes, the sanctuary team was preparing for an emergency rescue. A transport vehicle was sent, and by the time they reached her, she was barely conscious. She didn't flinch when they touched her, didn't react when they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. She was too weak to fight. The truck raced back toward the sanctuary. Every bump in the road made her body shift slightly, but she didn't move on her own. She lay limp, eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. By the time they arrived at the animal hospital, the vets were already waiting. They rushed her inside, working quickly. Fluids were hooked up to her fragile body. Vials of blood were drawn. A stethoscope pressed against her thin chest, listening for signs of weakness. The results confirmed what they had feared: malnutrition, dehydration, and a weakened immune system that had left her vulnerable to infections from the wild. She had been captive for too long. Her body had never been exposed to the dangers of the natural world. The bacteria in the carcasses she had eaten, the parasites in the soil, her system had no defense against them. The team stood outside the examination room, silent. They had fought so hard to free her. They had wanted to give her a life she had been denied, but in doing so, they had put her in a situation she wasn't prepared for. She had never been a wild cougar. She had been born in captivity, raised in chains, trained to perform for humans. The moment she was released, she had been at a disadvantage. And now, because of their decision, she was dying. The vets worked through the night. They treated her infections, replenished her fluids, and carefully monitored her heart rate. Slowly, her condition stabilized. By morning, she was still weak, still dangerously thin, but she was breathing more steadily. Her eyes fluttered open, though they were unfocused. She was alive, but she wasn't recovering, not really. Her body could heal, but something deeper was broken. She didn't fight against the IV in her leg, didn't grow restless in her cage. She just lay there, eyes open, staring at nothing. She wasn't resisting, but she also wasn't trying, and that was what scared the team the most. For the first time, they truly understood. Zara had never been free, not in the circus, not in the wild. She had spent her entire life under someone else's control. And now, even when given the chance to live, she didn't know how. Something had to change. If they wanted to save her, they had to do more than heal her body. They had to find a way to bring her back to life. Zara, the cougar, lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness. But her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. She had been given freedom, but she didn't know how to use it. She had been released into the wild, but she couldn't survive. Hunger had made her weak, sickness had nearly killed her, and now she was back in a cage. Not a circus cage, but an enclosure at the sanctuary. She was safe, but she wasn't living. The animal hospital had treated her infections. They had replenished her fluids and given her food, but she ate without hunger. Her body was recovering, but her spirit wasn't. She never growled, never showed fear, never resisted. She simply did as she was told, lay where she was placed, ate what was given to her, then closed her eyes again. It wasn't normal. The activists had seen rescued animals before. Some were aggressive, lashing out in fear. Others were anxious, pacing constantly, unsure of their surroundings. But Zara was different. She was silent. It was as if she had been trained not just to obey, but to exist without feeling. The veterinarian overseeing her care realized something. Zara's body could be healed, but if they didn't do something about her mind, she would never truly recover. So they called in an animal psychologist. She had worked with rescued lions, elephants, even wolves. But when she met Zara for the first time, she saw immediately that this was different. Zara wasn't just a traumatized animal. She was empty. For days, the psychologist simply sat near her enclosure, watching. Zara never reacted. Her golden eyes would follow movement. But she never showed curiosity, never showed fear, never showed anything at all. The psychologist spoke softly to her, bringing small objects into the enclosure, branches with fresh scents, pieces of raw meat hidden under logs, small moving toys designed to awaken her hunting instincts. Zara ignored them all. The team had known she wouldn't be able to survive in the wild, but they had hoped she could at least enjoy life in the sanctuary. Now, they weren't sure she was capable of enjoying anything. The psychologist tried everything. She moved food farther away to encourage Zara to walk to it. She introduced different scents, hoping to spark some reaction. She even played recorded sounds of other cougars, thinking it might awaken something deep inside her. Nothing worked. Then one afternoon, the psychologist noticed something strange. Zara didn't react to the sounds of other big cats. She didn't respond to the scents of the wild. But when the caretakers came in to clean her enclosure, she watched them. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't curiosity. It was something else. The psychologist realized what it was. Zara had spent her entire life around humans. Not other cougars, not the wilderness. Humans. They were the only creatures she had ever known. And they had never been kind to her. Now, even though the humans around her were gentle, she didn't understand how to respond. She had been trained to obey them, to move when told, to sit in silence when ignored. She wasn't afraid of them. She had simply learned that her existence depended on pleasing them. It was heartbreaking. The psychologist knew that if Zara had any chance at healing, she needed something she had never had before. A companion, but not a human. She needed something else. Something that wasn't trying to train her, wasn't trying to study her, wasn't trying to control her. She needed an animal that wouldn't be afraid of her, but also wouldn't see her as a threat. The psychologist made a call to a special animal therapy program. There was a dog, Annabelle, who had worked with traumatized animals before. She had helped nervous horses, fearful foxes, even injured wolves. She was gentle, patient, and trained to interact with animals who had lost their ability to trust. The sanctuary agreed to try. If nothing else had worked, maybe this would. Zara didn't know it, but the next day, her world was about to change again. Zara the cougar lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness. But her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. She had been given freedom, but she didn't know how to use it. She had been released into the wild, but she couldn't survive. Now, after nearly dying, she was back in a sanctuary, safe but not living. She spent her days in silence, showing no fear, no aggression, no curiosity. She existed, but that was all. The caretakers had tried everything to bring life back into her eyes. Nothing had worked. Then, one day, they brought in Annabelle. She was a golden retriever, trained to help traumatized animals. She had worked with nervous horses, anxious wolves, and injured deer. She had a way of making animals feel safe. But a dog and a cougar were not a natural pair. The caretakers knew it was a risk. Zara was still a predator, even if she had forgotten how to be one. But the psychologist believed that if anything could reach her, it was another animal, not a human. Annabelle was led into the enclosure. She didn't rush forward, didn't bark. She simply walked in calmly, tail wagging softly, sniffing the air. Zara was lying in her usual spot, her golden eyes watching from the shadows. Annabelle didn't go to her right away. She explored first, circling the enclosure at a relaxed pace, letting Zara observe her without pressure. She sniffed the ground, the logs, the feeding area. She acted like she belonged there, like this was just another place to exist. Zara watched. Then Annabelle did something unexpected. She walked closer, then rolled onto her back, legs stretched in the air. It was a sign of trust, a way of showing that she wasn't a threat. She was vulnerable, open, completely unafraid. Zara didn't move, but something in her eyes shifted. Annabelle stayed on her back for a few moments, then rolled onto her side, resting comfortably. She wasn't trying to force anything. She was just existing near Zara, in a way no other creature had before. The first day passed without much change. Annabelle moved around the enclosure, sniffing, stretching, lying down in different spots. Zara remained still, watching but never approaching. The next day, Annabelle did the same thing. She kept her distance but stayed near enough to be noticed. On the third day, something happened. Zara stood up. It was small, just a stretch of her front legs, a shift in her weight, but it was the first time she had moved without being forced to. Annabelle, still lying on the ground, lifted her head slightly, wagging her tail just once. Zara stepped forward, just one step, then another. Slowly, cautiously, she approached, her body low to the ground. Annabelle didn't move. She let Zara come to her, let her get close enough to sniff her fur, to breathe in her scent. Then Zara did something no one expected. She touched her nose to Annabelle's ear. It was brief, a small, almost hesitant motion, but it was the first interaction she had initiated on her own. The caretakers, watching from outside the enclosure, held their breath. Annabelle stayed still for a moment, then rolled onto her back again, paws up. And Zara didn't walk away. She stayed close, ears forward, eyes focused. It wasn't play, not yet. It wasn't affection, but it was interest. For the first time, she wasn't just watching the world pass her by. She was engaging with it. The caretakers exchanged hopeful glances. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had seen in weeks. Zara had spent 20 years without a friend, without a companion, without trust. Maybe, for the first time, she had found something worth waking up for. Zara the cougar lived in chains for over 20 years in a circus. When animal activists finally noticed her and set her free, they thought she would love her life in the wilderness, but her reaction made everyone cry bitter tears. She had been given freedom, but she didn't know how to use it. She had been released into the wild, but she couldn't survive. Now, after nearly dying, she was back in a sanctuary, safe but not living. Then Annabelle arrived, and everything started to change. The golden retriever had been brought in to help Zara heal in a way no human ever could. The first few days, Zara had only watched her from a distance, showing no emotion, no reaction. But Annabelle was patient. She didn't force anything, didn't push herself onto the withdrawn cougar. She simply existed near her, waiting. And slowly, Zara began to respond. At first, it was just small movements, small shifts in behavior that only the caretakers noticed. She lifted her head more often. She moved around the enclosure instead of staying curled up in one place. She stepped closer to Annabelle each day, observing her, sniffing her fur, watching as she played with the grass and rolled onto her back. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. Zara stretched, stood up, and flicked her tail in Annabelle's direction. It was a tiny movement, almost unnoticeable, but to the caretakers, it meant everything. It was a sign of awareness, of curiosity. Annabelle, ever patient, wagged her tail and took a step forward. Zara didn't back away. She stayed where she was, watching the dog carefully. By the end of the week, the two were walking side by side. The caretakers watched in amazement as Zara's body language changed. She moved with more confidence. Her steps became steadier. She began exploring different areas of her enclosure, rubbing against trees, sniffing the ground, marking her space. She wasn't just existing anymore. She was starting to live. The psychologist introduced small toys, balls made of leaves and sticks, logs placed at different heights. At first, Zara ignored them. But then she saw Annabelle swatting at a ball with her nose, pushing it around with playful energy. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the sanctuary, Zara did something she had never done before. She swatted the ball back. It was clumsy, uncertain, a movement made without thinking, but it was a start. Annabelle barked once, spinning in excitement, and for the first time since she had arrived at the sanctuary, Zara lifted her head and let out a soft, low sound. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a roar, it was something in between. It was life returning to her voice. Over the next few weeks, Zara continued to improve. She ate regularly, no longer needing to be coaxed. Her coat grew shinier, her muscles stronger. She no longer shrank away when the caretakers entered the enclosure. She didn't seek out their attention, but she didn't hide from them either. She had found a balance, a place where she could exist without fear. Annabelle still visited her daily, sometimes staying for hours, lying beside her, playing in the dirt, nudging her gently. They were an odd pair, the golden retriever and the once broken cougar, but together, they had found something neither of them had expected. Zara would never be a wild cougar. She would never roam deep forests or climb high cliffs, but she would live. She would feel the sun on her fur, stretch her legs without chains, breathe without fear, and this time she would not be alone. She had been given a second chance, not in the wilderness, but in the one place where she had finally found something worth waking up for. She was not a performer anymore. She was not a prisoner. She was simply Zara,